Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode on the New Books Network. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Miranda Melcher, and I'm very pleased today to be speaking with Dr. Lynn Tesser about her book titled Rethinking the End of Empire, Nationalism, State Formation, and Great Power Politics, published by Stanford University Press in 2024, which asks a lot of really interesting questions about nationalism, about empire, and about our conventional wisdom of how these things interact with each other in terms of external observers, local activists, insurgents, and what these processes look like on the ground across a lot of different places and times. So I don't want to give too much away before we get into the discussion. Lynn, thank you so much for joining me.
All right, my pleasure.
Could you please introduce yourself a little bit to get us started and explain why you decided to write this book?
Sure. Well, in some ways, I can trace the idea back to the first time I taught Introduction to International Relations. It was over 20 years ago, the first time I taught it. And I came up with this framing idea for the course, trying to understand why did the world go from rule mainly by empires to rule by nation states, and whether actual nation states or aspirational nation states. So since then, my career has taken a number of twists and turns. After teaching at a couple of U.S. universities, I worked at several think tanks, mainly in the Washington, D.C. area. Then I had about a 5-year period of traveling and teaching at other universities. One, for example, a new university in Bosnia-Herzegovina, another one in Cyprus. And eventually I found myself to the job I have now, which is for over the last 11 years, I've been teaching at one of the U.S. military colleges. So with that in mind, I do have to offer your listeners the usual disclaimer that all of my comments are really my comments, and they should not be understood as representing the views of the U.S. government, any military college, the Department of Defense, the Department of State, and so on. So they're my perspectives. And even though at the college I teach, the course curricula I offer tends to focus on international relations, U.S. government, regional studies. I would say my own areas of expertise. My first major research project looked at the effects of the expansion of the European Union. At that time, I was doing this research in the 1990s and then early 2000s. What effect EU expansion would have on ethnically cleansed areas in Eastern Europe, and with a particular focus on Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, although, of course, Czechoslovakia broke up into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. So that's kind of my first research area. Ended up in a book with the main title of Ethnic Cleansing in the European Union. And so for the last 8 or so years, I've turned my focus onto this larger question. Again, the one that I used when I started teaching Intro to International Relations, which is how do we go from a world ruled mainly by empires to a world primarily of nation states, whether actual nation states or aspirational nation states. So I would say, in other words, my specific research interests focus on the book's subtitle, which is Nationalism, State Formation, and Great Power Politics.
That makes a lot of sense as a focus. And I think that trajectory of your career is also a useful foundation for our discussion. So thank you for that. And for making that question kind of so central to our discussion. Is there anything further we want to say about the questions you're asking in the book and how you developed them?
Only that developing the specific questions of the book, it took some time to understand, well, what are some of the specific questions I need to focus on, potentially regionally specific to time period, The book has chapters, for example, on the Americas, extending from the pre-independence period in what would become the United States for Haiti, but it primarily focuses on the initial wave of state birth in Spanish America. I have a chapter on the Balkans in Anatolia, and also I do have one chapter as well on Greece, which is a really important case because it's the first country that's recognized for a particular people. And then moving on, the next chapter is on Central and Eastern Europe with a particular focus on the World War I period and then the immediate post-war period. And then the longest chapter of the book is on Asia and Africa. And to some extent, there are specific questions that pop up for in each chapter, but I tried at the same time to develop a narrative that could kind of apply through all cases to kind of bring everything together and frame the book.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, to have the kind of overarching questions and then the details of the case studies. And putting these all together kind of creates, I mean, as I'm sure the goal was, quite a powerful argument given the existing literature that exists on the topic. Can you tell us a bit more about the contributions and perhaps even correctives you're aiming for in this sense?
Sure, of course. I wanted the book, well, initially my focus was on the social science literature on state proliferation. And it really blossomed after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and then the breaking apart of Yugoslavia. There was kind of a flurry of studies coming out, multi-case studies, often quantitative studies that, try to explain why do we have these periods of state birth. For example, there was the political scientist Philip Reeder in his book, Where Do Nation States Come From? And he argued that, well, they come from pre-existing autonomy, which allows nationalist activists to agree on a singular nationalist program, and they're that much more effective because of that agreement in claiming a state of their own. We have another example from the international relations scholar Bridget Coggins. She's focused specifically on secessionism, and her argument centers on the preferences of great powers who, of course, have the decision-making capability to decide which states are recognized and which aren't. So she focuses on great power preferences, as well as the ability of the great powers to simply create states through the act of recognition. We also have studies that adopt the more long-standing argument is that we get new states because of the success of nationalist actors, that they're able to convince the people with whom they live that they form a nation and that nation needs a state of their own. So these are some examples of some of the arguments that orient multi-case studies on state proliferation, and they overlap in a way with the literature on nationalism. And nationalism, of course, it doesn't always result in the birth of new states. So there are a number of ideas in the literature on nationalism. I also wanted to engage the literature on international order, which is in the subfield of international relations, because this subfield surprisingly hasn't really examined why do we get a world of nation states ultimately. So what I wanted to do here is what eventually occurred to me is that these literatures, whether it's state proliferation, nationalism, or the international order literature, is they haven't really seen this activism in pre-independence periods. They first of all, they often haven't questioned whether, in fact, it was nationalism. And recent historiography has given us reason to question whether or not it really was nationalism. So the picture, the story that I tell in the book is more a story of state birth as the product of the politics of empire. So nationalist activists, if they are prevalent in pre-independence periods, they're not necessarily the central actors, because in a number of cases, I draw attention to host empires' policies, potentially during wartime, and how these policies might lead critics of empire to eventually turn in the direction of demanding separation from empire. So ultimately, I'm presenting a more complex story, but one that I hope is not so complex that readers won't be able to understand the book. I do try and frame, each chapter with reference to what are some of the existing arguments, specific arguments for these various regions and time periods, and then turn attention to some of the important innovations in recent historiography that raise a lot of questions about how we've tended to think that new states emerged because there were powerful nationalist movements acting to create new states, and that wasn't necessarily the case. So I'll stop there. You may have some questions about what I said.
Well, in fact, I think the best way to kind of illuminate what you've just laid out for us is to get into some of those cases specifically, to examine some of these traditional ideas about kind of pre-independence movements and national revolutions and the extent to which kind of further investigation bears that out. I'm wondering if you can speak specifically on the kind of combination, I suppose, of Western Hemisphere cases. So I'm thinking about the United States, Haiti, Mexico, and Colombia that very much have this traditional idea of kind of national revolution or liberal revolution, sometimes even liberal national revolution. How might you take a different or more skeptical perspective of this idea of what was happening before the actual moment of independence and then what came to be?
Right. Yeah. Thank you. This, because I grew up in the U.S. and I have memories of learning about the birth of the U.S. and how it was like a national revolution, a liberal revolution, and so forth. But the more I read, the more I started to question that. And my comments, I'll just limit it, because of time, to the United States and Haiti. So ultimately, the recent historiography is suggesting that is really questioning whether or not pre-independence unrest may be characterized as either national or liberal. So first of all, for the case of the United States, there isn't much evidence that exists to suggest that many people in the 13 colonies imagined a future as a single republic. Grievances, and they certainly existed, they also tended to be specific for each colony. But at the end of the day, if we can say that there was a collective grievance among the Americans in British North America, it was simply that the Creoles, and here I'm referring to the descendants of the British colonists, is there was a grievance that the Creoles didn't have representation in Parliament, and ultimately, because of that, they had second-class status. They weren't able to vote on the laws that would affect them. And then in my reading, I also learned that even these Creoles supported King George III, and it was really only after the initial coercive response to the outbreak of rebellion that we really see the independence, the efforts taken to independence really developing in a really strong way, or in other words, that insurgency is developing. So with that, again, I don't really see that, we have the birth of the U.S. is due to, a strong national movement that needed to have a state because it was a nation. Different grievances necessarily. And as far as, the U.S., the early U.S. being the result of a liberal revolution, well, I think the early Americans, even the elite Creoles, they wanted equality with the British colonists, but they didn't necessarily want broad equality across classes and races. Then turning to the case of Haiti, which is really a slave revolt. But even there, I learned in reading, recent historiography, and I'm particularly enamored of the work of historian Laurent Dubois on this case. But I learned that even the slave population was very divided, and it's a complex story. And also that given the high death rates among the slave population in the incipient Haiti, there was broad familiarity with rule by kings. So it wasn't necessarily that slaves expected to not be ruled by kings. But what's really important for kind of overcoming the divisions within Haiti, I would argue, again, based on recent historiography, that it's really the reimposition of slavery by Napoleon that's important for uniting the slaves in revolts and separating from France. So even though, again, the story of Haitian independence, it would seem like it's an easy story. Why would the slaves, just immediately be able to create a unified movement? But in fact, it was really difficult, and it took both liberating the slaves and then reimposing slavery to help bring them together to successfully revolt against France. Yeah, so these are just kind of a few details to give listeners a sense of how the historiography challenges, these longstanding conventional wisdom that both the American Revolution and the Haitian Revolution were national revolutions ultimately.
Yeah, no, very interesting to understand. And of course, it's worth highlighting to our listeners that our discussion is going to be sort of a highlights version of the book. That the book itself, I promise you listeners, has loads more fascinating detail. If you are intrigued by what Lynn is saying and want to hear more or read more, I suppose. But moving to another section of the book in our conversation, I'm wondering, Lynn, if you can tell us a little bit about how the politics of empire contributed to the rise of nationalism and popular sovereignty, again, complicating these kind of straightforward ideas of nationalism we might have, but looking this time to Central and Eastern Europe during and in the wake of World War I?
Right. Yeah. Thanks for the question. Once again, before I really started exploring the historiography, I, like many people, I think that empires broke up. Specifically, Austria-Hungary broke up because of the power of nationalist movements during World War I. And eventually, nationalism certainly is important, but we might actually ask why. So to take a step back for a moment, let me give your listeners kind of a different way of thinking about why nationalism does become powerful eventually. Is both Austria-Hungary as well as the Russian Empire. These were very diverse empires, and with a diversity that could in some cases be defined in national terms. So once we get to World War I, and of course Vladimir Lenin and Russia kind of really started this usage, at least during this war, kind of weaponizing the idea of national self-determination as a way of undercutting diverse empires. So what I mean by is that at both sides of the war, whether it was the Central Powers or the Allies, they both, in a sense, weaponized national self-determination to try and undercut their adversaries with the hope that non-dominant identities would define themselves as nations and hopefully engage in separatist behavior, and this would weaken the respective empire. So on the Central Powers side, let me add to that, is really significant, is we have Imperial Germany transporting Vladimir Lenin from Switzerland to Petrograd, as St. Petersburg was known at that time, in the sense, with the sense that Lenin might really help kind of weaken the Russian Empire. Then we might also look at the Central Powers offering kind of quote unquote protection for entities such as Poland or Lithuania, using the idea of protection to keep out rival forces. But if we turn to the Allied side, again, they're also kind of thinking about how national self-determination could be utilized opportunistically. Britain and France and the US are all interested in containing Germany through appeals to self-governance in these areas that lie between Germany and Russia, that we would eventually see after World War I, the birth of a number of smaller states, with the potential exception of Poland, of course. But speaking of Poland, the Allies saw the potential recognition of Poland and Czechoslovakia as a way to separate Germany and Russia. So even though I can't tell listeners, well, what was the actual effect of this opportunistic approach of both the Central Powers and the Allies? What was the effect of this opportunism towards the idea of national self-determination? And I don't have an explicit response to that, but I'm mainly trying in this chapter to question this assumption that nationalist movements were powerful because of their own efforts, rather than as things that developed, as events that developed in part because of what happened during the war. And then I might also add that it's only relatively late in the war that the Allies decide to break up Austria-Hungary into smaller states. So that's not a foregone conclusion. And with that, I would also argue that the reason why we have state birth out of Austria-Hungary in particular after World War I is because the victors, that's what the victors decided would happen. So it's based on these details. And of course, we also have for Austria-Hungary some of the policies the empire followed during the war, I would argue, helped make Austria-Hungary a victim, you might say, of this opportunistic approach to national self-determination.
This is a very interesting question that you ask in this section and kind of take us through the thinking of. So thank you for doing so here. I'd like to continue, however, our sort of, I suppose, geographical tour of the book, where we started with the US and Haiti, moving now to Central and Eastern Europe. And next, I'd love it if you could tell us about China and specifically help us understand why China didn't fragment after the fall of the Qing dynasty.
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, even though my book pays a bit more attention to cases, waves of state birth, successful waves of state birth, there are also cases where we might have expected empires to collapse and they didn't. Of course, this is China after the fall of the Qing dynasty. So we might have expected, for example, China to fragment, for example, its peripheral regions like Tibet, Mongolia, Manchuria, and to a lesser extent, Xinjiang, to kind of become independent states. But I think the reason this didn't happen is because we didn't see, around the time of the collapse of the Qing dynasty, is we didn't see great power support for breaking up China. By 1918, a few years after the Qing dynasty's collapse in 1911, the U.S. becomes the dominant power in Asia. And even when the U.S. assumes that role, it too doesn't support breaking China up into individual states. I could also add that China was not a losing belligerent in World War I. So being a losing belligerent in World War I, there's a good chance that your empire would end up breaking up like the Ottoman Empire or the Habsburg Empire. But nor did China experience, or the Chinese government wasn't strong enough to impose a centralization campaign on outlying areas with the power to produce kind of a counter reaction, which in some cases was separation from empire. That we can see this, for example, in the Americas is a good case. A good number of cases where, in the case of Spanish America, for example, when Ferdinand VII returns to Spain in 1813, he launches repressive rule there, and then a brutal counterinsurgency campaign in Spanish America. And this helps to tilt the Spanish colonies towards independence. But we don't see something like this in China, nor do we see, as far as nationalism as an ideology, whether separatist nationalism or an integrative form of nationalism. We don't really see that as widespread in China. Instead, the Chinese elites, given the time period under consideration, were more interested in trying to forge territorial unity as a defense against imperialism rather than to pursue kind of the breakup of empire.
Very interesting to go back to that particular moment. It is such a great question. Like, why didn't it happen? So thank you for explaining. We've been talking about these ideas of kind of national revolution and to what extent they actually hold out in the historiographical record. When we look at Algerian independence, the term national liberation is quite commonly used. You argue in the book that it, quote, obscures more than it reveals. Why?
Right. Yeah. If I remember correctly, I start the section on Algeria. It's not a very long section. It's probably about 4 pages. But as with the other sections of the book, and the Africa and Asia chapter has quite a few sections in addition to Algeria, such as a section on India and Pakistan, which also, by the way, discusses why India didn't fragment further, other than the birth of Pakistan and then Bangladesh. Later on. Sections on Malaysia, so forth. But going back to Algeria, so this short section refers to a number of different details that should lead us to question, once again, the use of the term national liberation for the birth of Algeria as an independent state in 1962. So that the term national liberation, it suggests that there's significant support for independence in Algeria prior to its birth in 1962. But to my surprise, I didn't really see that in recent historiography. For example, the initial urgings for independence come from Paris rather than Algiers. And in regard to the insurgency breaking out in 1954 and extending to 1962, the mostly young founders of the FLN, the National Liberation Front, driving the insurgency, they began it with little consideration of either objectives or political orientation. And initially it's more, it's of course a radical movement, but then eventually we get more moderate Algerians supporting the insurgency. And this happens in a sense because the French government's repressive response to the insurgency, in a sense, helps bring the reformists, the less radical, Algerians around to helping with the insurgency. But even then, by the time we get to late 1960, the insurgency in Algeria, it appears to be collapsing. at least until the rising of Muslims in the Algiers Kasbah at the end of that year. But then finally we have, in a sense, a vote in the mainland in France, metropolitan France, where we have 3/4 of voters approving of President de Gaulle's pursuit of Algeria's self-determination. So this section on Algeria kind of recounts, these are some details. There are of course more, and certainly there was support in Algeria. There was nationalism, but looking at, for example, the insurgency, some of these details suggested that we don't have this ongoing, consistently strong support for independence in Algeria. We have, in fact, a number of different ideas for change circulating. So that's why, looking at, the details like these, where if you just use the term national liberation to understanding the birth of Algeria, it really, again, it obscures more than it reveals, that there were other things happening there that eventually lead to the birth of Algeria. That, the term national liberation, once again, it just doesn't really help us understand what actually happened.
As you said, there's so much going on. The complexity is such an important part of this. And if we stay in French West Africa, that's true not just in Algeria, but in a number of other places in the region. In fact, you talk about that if we focus on the idea that many of these countries in French West Africa became independent after World War II, if we focus on just the independence aspect, we maybe lose out on the many different other options and political ideas that were being debated before then. Can you tell us a little bit more about kind of why it was that independence was the way that these things went, what some of the alternatives might have been?
Right. Yeah. So you're asking specifically about French West Africa, which I do, I do feature that centrally in the chapter on Africa and Asia. And I do want to refer readers to, one of the most important sources was the book of the historian Frederick Cooper, his book, Citizenship Between Empire and Nation, Remaking France and French Africa, 1945 to 1960. That's a book with Princeton University Press and published in 2014. That was a really important source for my book in terms of understanding, well, how, despite the diverse ideas and even a certain revulsion towards the idea of breaking French West Africa up into these smaller states. I mean, there was awareness amongst the African elites that breaking up into smaller states is not going to help French West Africa. These societies develop themselves, but they could very well fall prey to kind of a neo-imperialism, because of the likely weakness that smaller states will face when dealing with larger, wealthier, more powerful states. So one of the things I learned from Cooper, and there's a number of other books, particularly by the political scientist Adam Getachew at the University of Chicago. She has a fascinating book on, looking at how thinkers in post-independence Africa, and even some years before then, or primarily in the pre-independence period, they were thinking about, well, how to remake politics and economics in a way that would be more fair to the African population. But ultimately, my response to this question, well, why did independence, for smaller states eventually win out? I adopted Frederick Cooper's argument that it was basically because of kind of politics. It was the real or perceived threats to each leader's political base. So even though most African territories, or, your listeners are probably familiar that the great powers at the Berlin Congress in the late 19th century kind of divided Africa up and drew these lines, often straight lines between territories. So your listeners are also likely familiar that that during the period of colonialism, the parts of Africa, they didn't have autonomy, but nevertheless, the recognition of these territories as being territories within empire laid the basis for ensuing territorial level institutions around which political action and activism could center. So my chapter on Africa and Asia, and specifically the section on French West Africa, I do refer to the passage of the 1956 Framework Law, and this helps deepen the emphasis on territory by meeting Africans' key political demands to include territorially based assemblies that had genuine power. Another demand was a single electoral college, and then finally universal suffrage. So with that in mind, again, I think that Fred Cooper, is pretty much spot on here, is that even though, most of the African leaders, the eventual leaders of new states, and they didn't necessarily want intrinsically to have small states emerge out of empire, but it was because of this kind of developing emphasis on territory, and that each of the leaders had their respective political bases. And of course, they're already aware of ideas of nations and the discourse of nationalism. So it was something that was available to them. So even though none of them necessarily wanted this before independence, bit by bit, we eventually see a number of them making arguments about nationalism and using that to justify statehood. And again, it wasn't something everyone, the leaders wanted in beforehand, but it just sort of happened with respect to, again, the territorial emphasis in African politics, and particularly thanks to the 1956 Framework Law.
Very interesting to understand kind of that journey. Again, if we start from the end and then go backwards, or start from the end and assume that it was always that way going backwards, as you've described, we miss out rather a lot. So thank you for taking us through that piece of the book as well. If we then kind of zoom out, I suppose, and put all of these different pieces, all the different chapters together, what do you hope scholars, particularly of nationalism and decolonization, perhaps, though among others as well, take from this book?
Right. Well, I suppose, just in general, whether they're scholars or others that have some understanding of nationalism, is to really question the kind of romantic idea that we have, the number of scholars I think still have about nationalism and the importance of kind of having a pre-existing nation that really deserved its own state. And I think the historiography emerging within the last 3 decades that my book draws on really questions, the idea that we really had nations pre-existing in many cases before the birth of new states. Although this is perhaps more true for Western Europe, which my book doesn't cover because it tended to follow the birth of states, and then states defined as nations tended to follow a different trajectory than the former colonies or the former peripheral areas of the land empire. So I'm, in part because so much has been written on the rise of modern states and nations in Western Europe, I really focus on the rest of the world in my book, basically. And again, state birth out of the peripheral regions of the land empires and out of the colonies of the primarily the sea powers. So ultimately, to move us away from these romantic ideas of nationalism, and to see a fuller picture ultimately of how, what was the politics of empire, to include competition between empires, and empires, in some cases, we might define them as great powers, and who would engage in what international relations scholars refer to as great power politics, which could potentially affect identity, among non-state actors, how they use their identity. And in the chapter on Greece, for example, I do detail how interaction between non-state actors and non-state actors, in the Greek case, like many cases, they're diverse and there are different factions. And in the Greek case, we have a number of kind of well-educated men, young men coming from Europe, and they're aware of some of the new thinking, the idea of constitutions as the basis of government, and they want to bring this to the Ottoman Peloponnese, or what would become Greece, and they're kind of confronted with, the various people living in what would become Greece, and the various factions there didn't necessarily think the same way, although you could certainly find some people who did. But even while the Greek Revolution, of course, I think many romantic ideas about that, it was more a story of how to develop a narrative. For example, the idea of Greece not so much being a nation, but being a Christian people being persecuted at the hands of the Ottomans. So I think that narrative helped kind of bring around Europe's conservative powers, like Russia, Prussia, and Austria, around to potentially supporting a Greek state. So, but there's again, a story here about how does the framing work? How do the relationships between the great powers help contribute to certain ways of framing amongst the activists and insurgents? So we see this, of course, in other cases as well. But then regarding the phenomenon of decolonization, I would hope that readers of my book would also look back to, before the post-World War II waves of state birth, which are happening mainly in Africa and Asia, and in a sense think about decolonization happening in other periods in earlier times, and potentially even looking at, for example, the birth of new states in the Balkans, in the Ottoman Balkans. For example, the wave of state birth in 1878 that leads to recognition of Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania, as well as an autonomous area for Bulgaria. In some ways, we could see this not very well-known period as serving as an important precedent. So the book, I think, in a way suggests that we might look back earlier for scholars of decolonization, and also that decolonization could mean different, that even for the post-World War II Africa and Asia, could also mean different things to different people.
Those are some very good takeaways of the book, and a kind of nice conclusion of our discussion of it as well. So my final question is quite simply, what might you be working on now that it's done?
Right. Well, since I've spent about 8 years working on this, so it's been, I've learned so much doing it, and it's really a pleasure to, in some ways, answer the question that I posed, as I mentioned, when we first started speaking, the question I posed when I first started teaching. It's very satisfying in a sense to offer an answer to that, and one that I think, even though it does borrow to an extent from existing scholarly literature on nationalism and state proliferation, and of course also deviates from those literatures. But one of the things I think this project, I'd like to continue to work on it. The way that I decided to organize the book, it really kind of prioritizes the history, and so much new and interesting details are coming out of historiography, and I was excited to share these details with readers from different, if they're interested in nationalism or state birth or the end of empire or great power politics. I think there are details that readers will find fascinating. The one thing I would have liked to have done, but it was difficult because of prioritizing history, is to work more on the theoretical implications of all of these details. And I've just come back actually from the yearly scholarly conference in the U.S. for political scientists at the American Political Science Association. And one of the commentators, a well-known international relations scholar, was kind of pushing me to think more about some of the kind of broader global trends and trajectories that I might have considered in developing the book. So I think that's one avenue that I would like to pursue. But eventually, eventually, I will likely move away from this book. There's always the potential that I'll go back to, in a sense, some of the themes of my earlier research, which I mentioned. I mentioned my first book was called Ethnic Cleansing in the European Union, and it was really a story about how Europe, in a sense, went from the World War II and then post-World War II period. There was this trend towards creating ethnically homogeneous nation states, and the idea was that they were in a sense less likely to go to war. This was, for example, the reason for the Western Allies to agree to the German the population transfers of Germans from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. The idea was, by kind of moving Germans to Germany and Austria, it would be less likely for another German nationalist like Hitler to come along and argue that Germany needs to provide at least protection, if not annex, areas with German populations claimed to be mistreated. So in some ways, we're seeing a revisiting of this with Vladimir Putin's approach to Ukraine, using the argument that Russian speakers and ethnic Russians need protection. So in any event, so I might go back, in a sense, to revisit not necessarily the same question, but we've seen in recent years really all of the Europe, or much of the European Union, being focused more on the nation state and kind of being more critical of the centerpiece of the European Union, which is centered on the idea of free movement across of people, goods, capital, services across borders. So now that the pendulum has kind of swung back to ethnically homogeneous states, I might revisit that, but I think I'm still going to take a little bit of time to see what direction that I want to move next. So much has happened since I wrote my first book, but ultimately there's so much happening in the world these days that there's no shortage of things to write on. Well, in closing, do you have any suggestions of what to do?
I think there's so many interesting possibilities. Going back to those questions, kind of given what's happened since your first book, definitely sounds interesting. There's all sorts of things in the book we've been discussing, I'm sure, that could be kind of spun off and further investigated. So I'm quite intrigued to hear what you decide to work on next. Once you have, I think, that very important thinking time to do it. And I'm sure our listeners will be as well. And perhaps while you're doing that thinking, they will be reading the book we've been talking about, titled Rethinking the End of Empire, Nationalism, State Formation, and Great Power Politics, published by Stanford University Press in 2024. Lynn, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast and telling us about the book and your thinking and your work.
All right. Well, thank you for having me.